Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
The cake hadn't even been sliced yet when my mother, resplendent in a champagne-colored dress that shimmered too brightly for a 72nd birthday, clinked her glass with the polished silver knife and called for everyone's attention, like she was announcing the launch of a goddamn royal yacht instead of aging into irrelevance. I remember the room falling quiet, 40 people in our family's ancestral home, all cramped into the grand dining room with its oil paintings and hollow toasts, the kind of space where no one actually listened, but everyone heard what they were supposed to. She smiled, a taut, frozen expression like Botox and pride had been injected at the same time, and began thanking everyone for coming, as if any of us had a choice. Her voice always had that artificial softness, the tone she reserved for public performances, Sunday sermons, and photo ops with charitable checks she didn't write. She listed names: Aunt Ruth, Cousin Glenn, her bridge club friends, and then, without a breath, said something that carved the air in two. As part of my celebration, I want to share something special. I've recently finalized a decision that's been years in the making. I've made some updates to my will. Derek, she turned and raised her glass toward my brother, will inherit the house, the trust, and the company shares. It's time to pass the torch to the right child. There was a pause so sharp it could have drawn blood, and I swear the chandelier above us flickered, not because it was faulty, but because the tension in that moment could have killed the power grid. Some people gasped. Others pretended to sip wine and stare into their glasses like that was suddenly more interesting than watching a woman disown her daughter in real time. Derek, the golden boy with an ever-growing list of failed startups and a taste for overpriced tequila, looked like he'd just won an Oscar. And me? I didn't flinch. I didn't speak. I didn't even blink. I waited a beat, then raised my own glass, not to her, not to Derek, but to my own reflection in the antique mirror behind her, and said with a smile that burned hotter than any candle in the room, "That's okay. I just made partner." Her face cracked, not physically, no, but something beneath the surface buckled. The muscles around her mouth twitched like she was trying to pretend it was a joke, but the smile didn't return the rest of the night, and I didn't give her the satisfaction of explaining myself. That wasn't the moment to. That was the opening scene of something far bigger. You might think that was the worst thing she'd ever done to me, that public execution disguised as a birthday speech, but the truth is, it was just a final, desperate performance in a play she'd been staging my entire life. From the time I was a little girl in a lace dress standing on the periphery of family photos, to the honor student whose name was always mispronounced at award ceremonies while Derek's latest business venture got a round of applause at Thanksgiving. My place in the Monroe household was clear. I was the ghost at the feast, the contingency child, the one who was raised to be smart enough to survive, but never celebrated enough to shine. Growing up, my father was the only one who seemed to see me. He'd leave notes in my lunchbox when I had a math test, show the work. You're smarter than the problem, and he'd stay up late helping me build science fair volcanoes with baking soda and vinegar, while my mother flitted around on the phone, planning parties for people she pretended to like. But when he died 7 years ago, too fast, too young, and too quietly, it was like whatever tiny light had shone on me went out for good. He left without a real goodbye, without a proper conversation, and most painfully of all, without ever updating the estate plan he'd once promised we'd do together when things settled down. Things never did. They just unraveled. That night, after the birthday massacre, I left before dessert. I walked past relatives who couldn't meet my eyes, past Derek who was busy trying to impress a wine heiress with stories about family holdings, and past my mother, who stood near the fireplace like a queen, basking in the illusion that she'd finally put me in my place. I paused just briefly, catching Laura's eye, my best friend, my law partner, my co-strategist in a game my mother didn't even realize she was playing, and said, "She's going to regret that toast." Laura didn't reply. She didn't have to. I drove back to the city in silence, no music, no GPS, just the hum of tires and the drumbeat in my chest that told me something had shifted forever. I wasn't sad. I wasn't even angry. I was done playing a role in her story. It was time to write my own. And yet, the real twist hadn't even begun. Because what my mother didn't know, what Derek didn't understand, and what no one in that room suspected, was that I wasn't just coming for what was mine. I was coming for the whole illusion. The legacy she thought she controlled. The truth she buried with my father. And the power she gave away the moment she tried to humiliate me in front of that crowd. What happens next? Let's just say the cake wasn't the only thing about to get cut. The morning after my mother's grand betrayal felt eerily still, as though the city outside my apartment window had conspired with the universe to give me silence, not as a kindness, but as an unspoken dare. Daring me to unravel what decades of polite endurance, quiet obedience, and tightly managed distance had allowed to fester unchecked beneath the surface of our so-called family legacy. I sat at my kitchen table, not touching the coffee I had poured more out of habit than need, replaying every expression on every face from the night before. My mother's calculated serenity as she delivered her announcement with the same grace she used to recite scripture, Derek's smug surprise, as if he genuinely hadn't expected it, but quickly decided he deserved it all along, and the stunned, uncomfortable glances from cousins, family friends, and even Aunt Ruth, who, despite her usual cynicism, looked more shocked than amused for once. It wasn't the money that had burned. It wasn't even the will itself. It was the intent, the performance, the cruelty dressed as tradition. You see, my mother has always cared less about who wins and more about who watches. Her entire life has been a series of staged moments, carefully arranged for maximum impact, birthday announcements, family letters written in third person, charitable donations that required a full press release. But last night was different, not because it was another performance, but because she didn't realize that someone else in the room knew the script better than she did. I didn't go into the office that morning. Instead, I pulled a slim manila envelope from the bottom drawer of my bedroom dresser, one I hadn't opened in years, but had never dared to throw away. Inside was a single sheet of paper, handwritten by my father in the final months of his life, dated 2 weeks before his last hospital visit, with a sentence I had read so many times it might as well have been tattooed across the inside of my ribs. If anything ever feels off after I'm gone, talk to Laura. Trust her with the details. It had never made full sense until now. And though I didn't yet know what details he meant, I knew the letter was a breadcrumb left by a man who had grown wise to the manipulation surrounding him too late, and who wanted, in his quiet way, to leave me one last advantage. By mid-afternoon, I was in Laura's office. She'd already heard the story, of course, but hearing it from me, with the full weight of every word, brought a different kind of silence between us. She leaned back in her chair, eyes narrowed the way they always were when she was about to pull a thread until something snapped, and said simply, "So she went full Queen of Thrones, huh?" I laughed, but only briefly. I told her about the letter, the party, and the look on Derek's face when Mom raised that glass and tossed him her entire legacy like a golden bone. Then I asked what I hadn't dared to ask until now. "Can you get me the updated will?" Laura, being who she is, and thank God for that, had already anticipated the question. She opened her drawer, slid out a folder, and handed it over without a word. Inside were copies of the revised documents, stamped, signed, and oddly amended. That's what stood out. There was an addendum. A one-page note attached to the will, allegedly written by my father, changing the allocation of assets to favor Derek. The phrasing was off, too transactional, too cold, and the signature, while familiar, had something artificial in its rhythm, like someone had practiced copying it rather than signing it with the natural slant of years of routine. I felt my stomach tighten, not with grief, but with recognition. Something wasn't right. My father had always been deliberate with his words. Even when he was sick, he spoke slowly, carefully, weighing the emotional cost of every sentence. This note felt sterile, like a memo drafted by someone who didn't know how my father thought, only how he signed his name. I left the office with the folder tucked under my arm, feeling like I was carrying both a loaded weapon and a ticking clock. I wasn't sure which one would go off first. That evening, as the city lights blinked into existence and people on sidewalks laughed over dinners I would never eat again without second-guessing the motives of those around me, I called Aunt Ruth. She answered on the second ring, her voice as gravelly and unapologetic as ever. "I figured you'd be calling," she said. "I was hoping you would." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I asked her, point blank, if she knew anything about changes to the will, if she had ever seen my father sign anything that looked like an amendment, or if she had heard my mother mention estate planning in the final weeks of his life. There was a pause, long enough to make me think she might lie or hedge, but when she spoke, her tone had shifted from acerbic to something almost protective. She had him signing all sorts of papers those last few months, she said. Said it was just for convenience. He didn't even have the strength to read them all. I didn't say anything. I didn't need to. We both understood what that meant. Before we hung up, Ruth said one more thing. "Whatever you're planning, Hannah, make it clean. Make it smart. But don't let her win. Not this time." I promised her I wouldn't. That night, I didn't sleep. I opened the folder again and again, reading that forged page until my eyes blurred. I thought about how easy it would have been for her, how few people would question a widow adjusting her late husband's estate, how Derek would have accepted anything so long as it benefited him, and how I, the quiet one, the professional, the distant daughter with the airtight composure, was expected to do what I always did, nothing. But something had changed. This time, I wasn't reacting. I was preparing. I looked at the signature one more time, then slipped the page into a protective sleeve. I didn't know where it would lead yet, but I knew who forged it. And I knew who was going to prove it. There is a particular kind of woman my mother always wanted me to become: elegant without edge, agreeable without opinion, and polished to the point of invisibility. The kind of woman who sits in the corner of a room with perfect posture and a practiced smile, offering safe conversation and subtle praise for others' success, never daring to expect recognition for her own, and certainly never drawing attention to pain, injustice, or betrayal. And though I never quite fit that mold, I had learned, in the long and silent years of my girlhood, how to perform proximity to it, how to keep my voice measured even when I was furious, how to nod politely when overlooked, how to smile while bleeding. My mother didn't teach me love or trust or confidence, but she did teach me performance, and now, with the stage finally set and the curtain drawn, I intended to give the performance of my life. In the days following the will's revelation and the private confirmation of what I already suspected, that my father's signature had been forged, or at the very least manipulated onto documents he didn't fully comprehend, I didn't storm into battle. I didn't scream, accuse, or threaten. Instead, I returned to work, took client meetings, smiled through lunch with opposing counsel, and kept my routine intact, as though nothing had changed. And in a way, nothing had, because my mother had always underestimated me, had always assumed that silence meant surrender, and had never once considered that I might be capable of playing her game better than she ever could. It was Laura who made the first move, delicately and quietly pulling property transaction records from our private server, tracing back every asset that had been touched, transferred, or reassigned since my father's death. What we found wasn't just unusual, it was damning. A pattern began to emerge, subtle but unmistakable, of shell companies and account movements, each one linked by a single common thread: Derek. His name didn't appear directly on any of the filings, of course, but his fingerprints were there, in the corporate names that matched his old college usernames, in the sudden influx of capital to his defunct tech startup, and in the blind trust that had been activated just 3 weeks after my father's funeral. At first, I wanted to believe Derek was simply benefiting from my mother's manipulation, that he was too naive, too self-involved, or too careless to understand that he was being used as a proxy, a golden pawn in her desperate attempt to rewrite the family's legacy to her liking. But the deeper we looked, the clearer it became. Derek wasn't just complicit, he was eager. His smug confidence at the birthday party, his sudden financial flash, the newly leased Range Rover, and the real estate agent posturing on his Instagram stories, they weren't the actions of a man who had stumbled into wealth by accident. They were the habits of someone who had been promised something, who had been told he deserved it, and who had finally stepped into a role he believed was always his. I didn't confront him right away. I watched. I waited. I listened. I showed up to our mother's charity gala with a dress that clung to me like armor and a smile that told no one how close I was to detonating her carefully arranged world. I even complimented Derek's watch, a vintage Rolex that had once belonged to our father and, according to family lore, was meant to be passed down to me, though apparently, that lore had been quietly rewritten too. It wasn't until the end of the evening, when the donors had gone and the lights were dimming, that my mother pulled me aside, her tone soft but her eyes sharp, and said, "You've been very mature about everything, Hannah. I'm proud of you for not making a scene." And in that moment, I realized the full extent of her arrogance, not just that she believed she could steal from me in public, but that she believed I was too disciplined, too above it all, to fight back. She mistook my restraint for weakness. She always had. I responded with something so simple, so venomous in its elegance, that I think she didn't understand the threat until long after I'd walked away. I learned from the best. The following morning, I met with a forensic analyst, a woman named Denise who specialized in estate fraud, a woman whose entire career had been built on quietly dismantling cases like mine. I gave her copies of every document we had, including the suspicious addendum, and asked for a full handwriting analysis, along with pressure signature tests and forensic imaging. She looked at the pages, then at me, and asked, "Do you want a report strong enough for court or discreet enough to make someone run?" I didn't hesitate. "Both," I said. While Denise began her work, Laura continued tracing the money. What we found next felt less like a discovery and more like an affirmation of what I had already begun to suspect in my gut. One of the shell accounts linked to the reallocation of estate assets had made a substantial payment to a legal consultancy in the Bahamas, an offshore specialist known for their ability to launder estate funds through family restructuring services, which, in polite terms, meant helping wealthy people disinherit inconvenient relatives. My mother hadn't just cut me out. She had paid to erase me. That night, I sat on the balcony of my apartment, staring out over the city I had built my career in, the city that never once applauded me for being anyone's daughter, but respected me for being ruthless, competent, and entirely my own. I thought about my father, about the time he told me that being good wasn't the same as being noble, and that being fair didn't always mean being right. I thought about the way he'd sigh when my mother rewrote history at dinner parties, how he would quietly excuse himself rather than challenge her, and how that kind of silence, his silence, had become my inheritance. But not anymore. Because now I was speaking, not with words, but with action. And the story I was about to tell would not be one she could rewrite. It would be built with facts, confirmed by evidence, and delivered with precision. The legacy she tried to give to Derek was already crumbling under the weight of truth. And I hadn't even started yet. For most of my life, I believed that some lines, no matter how deep the resentment, no matter how broken the bond, were simply too sacred to cross, too irreversible to justify, too low for even the most vindictive parent to stoop to. I had assumed, naively, that no matter how much my mother disapproved of who I had become, or how much she favored Derek's smooth-talking recklessness over my cautious resilience, she would never commit an act so deliberate, so coldly orchestrated, that it would make strangers out of us in the most permanent, paper-bound sense of the word. But as the evidence mounted, as Denise's report came back with the quiet authority of science and decades of legal precedent, I realized something even more chilling than the forgery itself. My mother hadn't simply cut me out of her will. She had rewritten my father's last act of protection, and in doing so, she had carved my name out of our family's history with the precision of a surgeon and the pettiness of a woman who never quite learned to tolerate a daughter who wouldn't shrink. Denise's report was damning in a way only factual, emotionless documentation can be. It didn't scream. It whispered with devastating certainty. The signature on the will's addendum was not consistent with my father's known writing habits. The ink density suggested it had been written weeks after the date listed, and the pressure patterns indicated a different hand entirely, one used to imitation, one with motive. There was no room left for doubt. The will had been altered. And not just altered, it had been faked and weaponized. I remember staring at the report on Laura's office desk, feeling the sting of it in my throat, Not because I was surprised, but because something in me had held onto a flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, there had been some misunderstanding. Some legal maneuvering I hadn't been privy to. But no. It was a forgery, plain and calculated, and now I held the proof in my hands. Laura, ever calm in the eye of a storm, looked at me with the same expression she wore during closing arguments, assured, clear, deadly. "We can take this to court," she said, her voice low but firm. "We can file a formal petition to challenge the will, freeze the estate, and launch a full discovery process." But I shook my head. Not yet. Not this way. Because as satisfying as legal justice might be, I wasn't interested in dragging my family's name through public mud unless I had to. I didn't want newspaper clippings or court transcripts or the whispered gossip of family friends. What I wanted was control. What I wanted was to remind Margaret Monroe that power, once stolen, could be stolen back, and when it would be quiet, precise, and devastatingly permanent. The opportunity presented itself sooner than I could have planned. Derek, emboldened by the illusion of inheritance and blissfully unaware that his empire was built on sand, announced a legacy dinner at the family estate, an event so transparently self-indulgent it would have been laughable if it weren't so infuriating. He framed it as a celebration of our father's entrepreneurial spirit and an unveiling of the next chapter in Monroe family leadership, which, as far as I could tell, meant more photos of Derek shaking hands with investors and a speech written by a PR intern who'd clearly Googled our last name that morning. I accepted the invitation without hesitation. The estate hadn't changed much since my last visit, still grand, still meticulously maintained, still full of ghosts that no one ever dared name aloud. But there was something brittle in the air that night, something hollow about the flowers arranged in vases too large for the tables, the candles flickering just a little too aggressively, the staff moving with the quiet tension of people who know they're working a performance, not an event. Derek greeted me at the door with a glass of champagne and the kind of grin that only ever comes from money you didn't earn. "Didn't think you'd show," he said, his tone somewhere between teasing and taunting. I smiled, took the glass, and replied, I wouldn't miss the family photo for the world. The evening unfolded with all the pomp I expected: speeches about legacy, videos of our father cobbled together from old footage, testimonials from Derek's friends about his vision, none of whom had known our father beyond a polite handshake and a head nod at holiday parties. And then came the final toast, the moment Derek had clearly rehearsed in the mirror, to the next generation of Monroe leadership, to preserving our name with honor and courage, and to making our father proud. I didn't clap. I didn't raise my glass. I simply stood, locked eyes with my mother from across the room, and smiled, not the kind of smile she had spent years teaching me to wear, but the kind of smile that says, I know everything, and I'm not here to argue. I'm here to win. Later that evening, as the guests filtered out and the champagne lost its chill, she found me standing alone in the library, our father's favorite room, the only place in that mansion that had ever felt like it belonged to me. She closed the door behind her with the quiet resolve of someone used to managing confrontations in private and said, You're making a mistake, Hannah. This can't end well for anyone. I turned, deliberately slow, and took in her face, the flawless makeup, the pearls, the steely eyes that had once terrified me as a child, but now looked like glass just before it breaks. You should have thought of that before you forged a man's signature on the last decision he ever made, I said, letting the words hang between us like smoke. She tried to deny it at first, of course, called it absurd, ridiculous, even beneath me. But she didn't ask how I knew. She didn't ask if I had proof. Because she already knew. And her silence was louder than any denial could have been. When I left that night, I didn't slam the door. I didn't cry. I didn't feel victorious, not yet. But I did feel certain. Certain that the story wasn't over. Certain that she no longer held the pen. And most importantly, certain that the next move would be mine, and it would be the one she never saw coming. There is a moment, just before a carefully built lie collapses, when everything goes unnaturally still, not the peaceful kind of stillness, but the kind that feels like the air itself is holding its breath, bracing for impact. knowing that whatever has been buried for too long is finally clawing its way to the surface, sharp and undeniable. That stillness hovered around me in the days following the legacy dinner, wrapping itself around the corners of my life, quieting the noise I'd grown used to, my mother's ever-curated social performances, Derek's insufferable public posturing, the idle chatter of relatives who had always watched from the sidelines without ever daring to pick a side. And in that silence, I moved with precision, no longer searching for truth, but preparing to deliver consequence. The legal path was already underway. Laura had submitted a quiet but firm request to the estate board, one that didn't raise alarms but raised eyebrows, requesting a reevaluation of the will's most recent amendment on the basis of signature irregularities and potential undue influence during a known medical decline. The language was intentionally neutral, clinical even, because the goal wasn't to stir scandal, it was to apply pressure, to open a door we knew they couldn't close without at least pretending to investigate. And once that door was open, once they saw what we had, the report from Denise, the notarized handwriting comparisons, the transaction trails leading to offshore restructuring firms known for laundering inheritance fraud, it was only a matter of time before silence turned to scrutiny. It wasn't public. Not yet. But it was real. And the tremors had begun. Derek, predictably, was the first to falter. His bank flagged the recent activity in his accounts, money that had come from the blind trust my mother established, which had now been frozen pending an internal audit. The Range Rover disappeared from his driveway 2 days later, and the real estate agent who had been gloating about the Monroe estate expansion on social media quietly deleted every mention of the family from her page. He called me, once, just once, and left a voicemail that started confident and ended shaky, like he couldn't quite decide if he wanted to threaten me or beg me to stop. I didn't call back. There was nothing left to say. He had chosen his side long ago, and now he would learn what it meant to be trusted with stolen goods. But it was my mother's reaction I had waited for, and when it came, it arrived not with rage or denial, but something far more unnerving: control. She showed up at my office unannounced, dressed in charcoal gray cashmere and wearing the same scent she'd worn my entire childhood, the one that used to make me flinch instinctively before I even turned around. She didn't ask to sit. She didn't make small talk. She closed the door behind her, set her gloves carefully on the table like she was placing a chess piece, and said, "You've made your point. Now let's talk." There was no apology. Of course not. My mother doesn't apologize. She reframes. She redirects. She offers half-confessions cloaked in concern and conditional accountability. "I never meant for it to go this far," she said, as though forging a will was a misunderstanding, as though systematically erasing my name from the legacy my father intended me to carry with some regrettable oversight in a busy week. "I was protecting the family," she added, which I suppose, in her mind, meant preserving her illusion of control, of legacy, of authority that couldn't be questioned. I let her speak. I let her wind her narrative into the air like smoke, delicate and hard to grasp. And when she finished, when the performance had run its course, I looked at her, really looked at her, and said, "This doesn't end with a conversation over coffee." She blinked once, slowly, calculating. "I don't want your apology," I continued. "I want everything you took from me, and I want your signature, this time real, on a document that makes that transfer legal, binding, and irreversible." She didn't move. For a moment, I thought she might laugh, or curse, or slam her hands on the table the way she used to when I defied her as a teenager. But she didn't. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a pen, gold, engraved, undoubtedly gifted to her by some board she chaired, and said, "Show me the papers." Laura entered 5 minutes later. The documents were already drawn, crafted with the same meticulousness my mother had always admired in me, even if she could never say it aloud. The lake house, the trust account, my father's watch, and one final clause that required her to sign a sealed affidavit acknowledging that the amended will had been processed in error during a time of emotional distress. A phrasing we agreed on to avoid litigation, but which would function, in practice, as an admission. If she ever challenged it, the full forensic report would go public. She knew the game. She signed. It didn't feel like victory, not in the way people imagine it, with triumphant music and celebratory drinks. It felt quiet, heavy, satisfying in the way that survival often is, not because you've won, but because you're still standing. A week later, I drove to the lake house alone. The keys were in my coat pocket, the deed tucked into the glove compartment, and my father's watch, long hidden among Derek's belongings, now sat silently on my wrist, ticking with a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar. The air by the water was cold, but not unkind. I sat on the porch where he used to drink his coffee, where he once told me, when I was 17 and terrified of disappointing everyone, legacy isn't what they leave behind, it's what they try to take from you when they realize you don't need them anymore. I unfolded the letter Laura had slipped into the legal packet, a letter she found tucked into one of our father's locked briefcases that had been mistakenly placed in storage rather than destroyed, as instructed by Margaret's estate manager. It was short, barely a paragraph, and written in my father's handwriting, steady and familiar. For my daughter Hannah, who never asked for anything except the truth. You don't need what I've built to build something better, but if she takes it from you, take it back. And never forget whose name is on the foundation. That night, as the moon rose over the lake and the house creaked with the weight of its new beginning, I didn't feel victorious or even vindicated. I felt whole, not because she gave it back, but because I had proven I never needed her to. And maybe she knew that too. Maybe that was why, in the end, her smile never came back. And maybe, just maybe, that was the real inheritance all along.